Kapil Bhai, Dr. Dangayaj, distinguished members in the audience. It's indeed my pleasure to be here before you, and I'm thankful to the Ahmedabad Management Association for inviting me here to come and speak before you. What we are witnessing today is, in my judgment, a kind of an epochal change that is taking place in the world. So we are living through very historic times. Why I say that is that if you look at New York Times of last week, you realize that all governments in the world put together are putting in roughly $10 trillion worth of intervention in the economy. Now, $10 trillion, when I say, it does not mean it's just a handout. There are different ways in which it is being pushed into the economy, whether in terms of liquidity, whether in terms of guarantees, etc., etc. But $10 trillion is not chicken feed. If you go back to roughly a year from today, you found that if a government announced an intervention of, say, even $10 billion, that was considered huge. And today, $10 trillion are being announced, and that is unable to stem the tide of the decline that is taking place in the world economies. And as you know, just last week, the US economy was declared to have been in recession, not now, but from December 2007. So it's almost a year long that the recession has been going on. The Eurozone, much of Eurozone has been declared to be in recession. Japan has been declared to be in recession. Other economies, big and small, are in recession. Some of these economies, smaller economies, are on the verge of collapse, like Hungary, like Iceland, like Ukraine, like Pakistan, and so on. So in other words, what you see is that huge economic distress is all over. And in spite of massive interventions by the government, things are not coming under control. And what do I mean by that? In June 2008, if somebody told you that Goldman Sachs would not be what it was, that if Lehman Brothers would not exist, if somebody had said that Sensex would go down below 10,000, if somebody had said Dow Jones will go down below 9,000, if in June 2008, just 5 months before, if somebody had mentioned all this to you, you'd have been saying, this fellow is crazy. But not only this, all this and much more has happened. You know, companies and entities that were considered to be too big to fail, like AIG, with over $1 trillion of assets, have failed. Citibank, with over $2 trillion of assets and operations in more than 100 countries, has failed and has had to be bailed out by the government. Not only that, think about the speed at which things are happening. So what was happening in June, we could not anticipate that what would happen in, say, September, October, November. You think of it, Citibank was considered to be an all-right bank. Not necessarily a healthy bank, but was considered all-right compared to Lehman Brothers, Merrill Lynch, and others. And it was supposed to take over Wachovia. The Fed had agreed that it would take over Wachovia because Wachovia was collapsing. Okay? And the same Citibank, within a month and a half of when it was supposed to take over Wachovia, it couldn't take over, that's another story, but it was considered to be all right at that point of time, suddenly collapsed. Similarly, the largest Japanese bank, okay, which invested $10.5 billion into JP Morgan because it was supposed to be better off, suddenly started collapsing and had to raise $10.5 billion in the market. And as a result, the Japanese markets and all took a plunge because of this. So in other words, entities that only a month and a half back or 2 months back or 3 months back were considered healthy have suddenly collapsed. So you can appreciate the speed at which change is taking place. It's a very, very dramatic change. Economies like, for instance, the IMF suggested at the start of this year that the US economy would grow at roughly about 1% per annum. Then about 6 months later, it revised it to, it would grow at 0.5%. And now in November, it said it'll decline by 0.7%. And the latest figures are it'll decline by maybe 3 to 4%. Okay? So even the IMF could not anticipate much of what was going on. So in other words, what I'm trying to suggest is that we are in really a very deep change that is taking place in the world of finance and in the world of economics. And if we are to do anything about it, then we need to know what the problem is. Because if we don't understand the problem, then we won't have a solution to it. So I therefore have a few, in this introductory thing, a few questions. First is that this is so deep, because if the world economy as a whole is about $65 trillion, and if government interventions are of the order of about $10 trillion, it's a huge intervention. In any normal time, if the governments had intervened by $10 trillion, demand would have risen enormously and there would be hyperinflation. But today, there's a move towards deflation rather than inflation. Okay, the world oil prices have dropped, various commodity prices have dropped, only food prices have not dropped, but otherwise large number of other prices have dropped. And there's worry in the world today that there could be deflation. And deflation would certainly mean the world economy, instead of just going into recession, would go into depression. So when the world economy is declining and prices start falling, then there's a certainty that one would head into a depression, because all decisions would get postponed, and therefore the chances are of a depression. And a depression is far worse than a deep recession. So in other words, what is happening is that today there's a crisis, and we have to ask ourselves, is this specific to the financial sector, or is this a deeper crisis of the world economy? So is it a specific form of capitalism that is failing, and therefore if we reform that, then we'll be all right? Or is it a generalized decline in the capitalism, and therefore we require a generalized solution to this decline? So that's the first question that we need to pose to ourselves. The second point in this is that this crisis was not anticipated by the experts. Okay? And that's why it is argued by some that we've delayed intervention. And so I remember writing in February this year, when $150 billion tax cut was announced by the US government, that this is too little, too late. Why? Because by then, in the housing market, the collapse had been already by about $1 trillion. So you cannot reflate an economy which is collapsing by $1 trillion by pumping demand through the tax cuts of $150 billion. So that's why it's too little, too late. When $700 billion package was announced by the US government, at that time also, because the collapse was already in trillions of dollars, $700 billion was also too little, too late. Okay? And therefore, things kept on collapsing. Things did not stabilize in spite of the announcement of $700 billion of intervention. So in other words, what I'm trying to suggest is that delay is fatal in this kind of a situation. What you could have done in August 2007, when the subprime crisis was noticed to be taking place in a big way, what you could do then, you could not do in February. What you could do in February, you cannot do today. And that's why any package that is put in place has to be very large. And that is where it is fatal for the US economy that there's a 3-month gap between one president going and the next president coming in. And Obama did not attend the G20 meet for his own reasons, but that loss of 3 months will prove to be very, very problematic, because already the US economy is in the decline, and with the declining rate of 3% which is suggested for the coming quarter, if that turns out to be true, then you're losing roughly $400 billion every month for each percentage point decline. Now, in that kind of situation, the package that you'll require on 20th January when Obama takes over would be far larger than what would be required today if you want to turn things around. So therefore, it's very essential to realize that the experts did not anticipate it, and for that you just need to go to the New York Times Interactive of September 19th. And there they've given the various statements of the US Treasury Secretary going back from August 2007 up to September 19, 2007. And you can see in that it was only thought to be a liquidity crisis. And it's only in July that it was said, okay, there's a liquidity crisis, but there's also a model crisis. But it's only on September 19th that the US Treasury Secretary begins to say there's a systemic collapse. And if we don't get this $700 billion, then this systemic collapse cannot be prevented. So this realization that what was happening would lead to a systemic collapse came about 14 months too late, by which time the requirement of correctives was far, far greater. And what are these correctives? We'll try and look at that. Okay. There's another thing that is said, that the subprime crisis is the root cause of this financial crisis. The question to ask is that the reason why the crisis is taking place, or is there something underlying that because of which the subprime crisis emerged? So what was it in the real economy